We can hear you very well, loud and clear.
We can
Yes.
hear you. We can
Everybody
hear
can.
you. Yes.
Okay. 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 Good afternoon, everyone from Nigeria, and good morning, every other person from America. So we are here. We are here for a NAPE-AAPG collaboration, and then I'll just go through how the day or the session will look like. So here, this is the agenda we will be following. First, our president, NAPE president, will give us our welcome remark. That will be followed by the AAPG president's welcome remark. Next, we'll go into the reading of the profile of the AAPG president, and then technical presentation by the AAPG president. That will be followed by a Q&A session and then a vote of thanks. So at this point, I'll leave the floor for Mr. John Bosco Uche, the NAPE president, to give us his welcome remark.
All right. Thank you very much, our NAPE Public Secretary. And by the way, Tunde, I don't think we're on this slide yet. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, our distinguished NAPE members and associates and friends. And then also good morning for our friends on the other side of AAPG, and a special welcome to this technical forum, our own president as well, Deborah Sacrey of President AAPG. I want to say that, I mean, we've actually worked out to have this day happen. We've had a couple of discussions with the AAPG president in the last few weeks and months. And by the way, just upfront, just to extend my appreciation to a past president of this association, a fellow of this association, Mr. Victor Abo Davis, who has also helped to ensure that we were able to get to the point of having this collaboration. We had series of conversations to see if, again, the AAPG president will visit here in Nigeria, but we felt we can't kick off this collaboration with this technical forum we're having today. And it's my honor to especially welcome every single one of you on the call, about 100 of you right now on the call, to this technical forum. But again, it's I know we're going to be listening to the AAP president, but it's also a mark of demonstrating the strength that we have across both on the side of AAPG, which is an association that has existed for over 100 years, but also for NAPE, who actually will be 50 years this year in August. And NAPE, as many of you on the call will know, or you may not know, for those that are joining us for the first time, that Nigerian Association of Petroleum Exploration is the biggest professional association of petroleum geoscience related and related disciplines here in Nigeria, but also in Africa. And therefore, we are the leading voice in this sector in terms of championing the cause for continuous research, continuous work in oil and gas industry around petroleum-related topics. In NAPE, we do say our ideas find oil and gas. And that's what we do. And we do this across the industry, but also together with our fronts and the members in academia. Again, we pride ourselves in our membership of over 12,000, and that gives us the breadth to be able to take that leadership role that we're having in this continent, and we'll continue to do so. And we do believe that our relationship with AAPG that have existed for many years can be strengthened to even do more than we're doing at the moment. And I'm sure after today, this will be the mark or the kickoff of that increased collaboration. Again, many of you may know or may not know again that we started our relationship with AAPG actually about 30 years ago. in 1994 precisely, when we started to have the relationship we have with AAPG, and we have continued to do so, where our members has been quite active on the AAPG side, at the African region, and in all the activities that is done globally. And that's something we want to continue to do, and have this also on both sides, both at our NAPE events, having AAPG to participate actively, but also NAPE folks to participate actively at the AAPG events. So I just wanted to paint this background as part of my opening. But I also want to then use this opportunity because, again, it's going to be an extended welcome remark in terms of look ahead and things that we can actually continue to improve on. If we look at the, joint workshop or conferences we've had together in the past, we haven't done any one in the recent time. I think the last one would have been sometime around 2010, 2011, when we had the Deepwater Offshore West African Conference, and it was largely driven by both NAPE and AAPG at the time when deepwater activities was building up. So ever since then, I don't think we have done anything close to that nature. We do believe that having geoscience focused and workshops and conferences that is focused on the oil and gas exploration in West Africa and Africa at large is something in some areas I think we can do a lot more than we're doing at the moment. And this is also not just for the active members, but also for our young professionals. We do believe that we could also have leadership symposium that we can do and leverage the strengths of the association on both sides. I do know as well that the IBA, which is the Imperial Barrel Award, is an award that many of the Nigerian universities actually participate in and continue to do so. Actually, a few weeks ago, we held a NAPE and AAPG African region training to prepare our members, our students that are going to be participating at this year's IBA, but also the NAPE Basin Evaluation Competition, which is an equivalent. So this is going well, is working well, but I think we can also continue to improve on this by having more activities. And that could also include the AAPG Distinguished Lectures. For example, we can have that in a virtual sense so that our academia can actually benefit from the strengths of the AAPG globally. The digital library on both sides, I think we can also find a way to leverage on the strength of our papers and bulletins available at our library. And we do believe that our members on both AAPG or AAPG can benefit from this. So these are some of the initial thinking that under my leadership, I think, working with yourselves, Madam President, Mrs. Deborah Sacrey, we can find a way to extend this type of collaboration, which has existed in the last 30 years, but we'll see how to strengthen it even better as we move forward again for the next 30 years from today. So on that note, I really want to welcome every single one of you. And I do believe that, one day the AAPG president will again return back to our NAPE conference that we typically hold in Lagos. And we will also have more of the NAPE leadership participating at some of the AAPG events like the Image or the ICE, as the case may be. So on that note, I will say thank you once again, ladies and gentlemen, and please do stay back as we listen to the AAPG president first on her opening remark, but also eventually listening to a key topic which is very important at this moment around the artificial intelligence, AI on seismic interpretation and learning from her experience. So with that, I will hand back to you, the Public Secretary. And thank you once more, everybody.
Well, thank you very much for your kind remarks. And I too look forward to a much greater collaboration between NAPE and AAPG. AAPG, of course, is probably the premier organization in the world for understanding the subsurface. It's been around for 108 years, and we have a cadre of intellectual property that is just astounding. But let me kind of give you a little story about where I'm really impressed with what Africa is doing, especially Nigeria. I just came back from the IPTC conference that was held in Kuala Lumpur a couple of weeks ago. And the IPTC sponsors students from all over the world, but primarily Africa, Middle East, and Asia Pacific. There was a competition of 500 students, and 50 were awarded scholarships to be able to come to the conference and meet and greet and network with industry professionals. And I met some outstanding students, many of whom belong to AAPG student chapters throughout the region. And there was one gentleman from Nigeria that I was totally impressed with because he was like 6'3". I mean, he towered over the crowd, and he was so intelligent and so eager. And it's refreshing to see that in students from all over that part of the globe, because in the US, the press has so marginalized the fossil fuel industry that many of our universities are actually shutting down their geology department. So it's quite incredible and very encouraging to see the enthusiasm from the students and the people in other areas where they're not as effective. Their universities are still have robust programs, and I really appreciate that, because there is a huge future in the fossil fuels. We're going to need oil and gas and fossil fuels well into the next millennia, or the next 100 years. So I just want to say congratulations on curating a great batch of students over there. I was just totally impressed. But yes, I think there's a huge opportunity for collaboration. I can appreciate everything that your region, and I'd say the Africa region and as a whole, is trying to do to promote the industry and sponsorship and to get in and enhance the production that you have, plus find new. And that's part of the presentation I'll be doing today, is to show how we can reduce risk and increase profitability and opportunity in the subsurface in finding fossil fuels. Now, AAPG has a very robust program going in geothermal, and we have a good program going in CCUS. But it all relates to the subsurface. If you don't understand your reservoir, regardless of the fluid content, then you're not going to be able to take advantage of it. And we have a series of Zoom or network seminars that we put on that like orphan wells and things like that I think that we can tune into and work with NAPE to bring information, transformation, education to your organization. And I look forward to a great collaboration with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much from here as well. Thank you. All right. So on that note, I think we will switch over now, PS on the profile now, before we get into the presentation. You want to go ahead with that? Antonio, you can start sharing again the screen. Antonio, can you bring up the profile? Thank you. PS.
Okay, hold on. Okay, so Deborah, so is an introduction of Deborah King Sacrey. Deborah is a geologist, geophysicist with 49 years of oil and gas exploration experience in both North America and internationally. She received her degree in geology from the University of Oklahoma in 1976 and immediately started working for Gulf Oil in their Oklahoma City offices. She started her own company, Urban Energy, in 1990 and built her first geophysical workstation using Kingdom software in 1996. She helped SMT/IHS for 18 years in developing and testing Kingdom software. She specializes in 2D and 3D interpretation for clients in the US and internationally. For the past 15 years, she has been part of a team to study and bring the power of multi attribute neural analysis of seismic data to the geoscience public, guided by Dr. Tom Smith, founder of SMT. She has become an expert in the use of Paradise software and has had many discoveries for clients using multi-attribute neural analysis. Deborah has been very active in the geological community. She's past national president of the Society of Independent Professional Earth Scientists, past president of Division of Professional Affairs of AAPG, past treasurer of AAPG, and past president of the Houston Geological Society. She's also past president of the Gulf Coast Association of Geological Societies and has been on the advisory council of AAPG twice. Deborah is also a DPA certified petroleum geologist and DPA certified petroleum geophysicist. She's currently president of AAPG. She belongs to AAPG, SIPS, Houston Geological Society, South Texas Geological Society, and the Oklahoma City Geological Society. So now let's welcome Deborah as she presents a paper titled Application of Artificial Intelligence in Seismic Interpretation. So you're welcome, Ms. Deborah Sacrey, and you can take the floor now for your presentation.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. So let me pull up my presentation.
Share your screen.
Yes. Can everyone see this yet? Can you see it?
Yes, we can. We can.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to discuss today is the application of artificial intelligence and machine learning when it comes to seismic interpretation, or how to really understand the subsurface. So what I'll be talking about today, if I can get this to work, is I'll be looking at what I call self-organized maps. This is unsupervised classification of data. Now, as humans, we tend to want to organize things that make it where it makes it easy to find stuff we're looking for. So we may have a file cabinet with drawers that represent different parts of our life or information. And in those drawers, we may have folders. One folder may have all of your electric bills. One folder may have all your medical bills. One folder. In other words, we take disparate amounts of information and organize it so that it makes sense to us and we can find it easily. Well, that's kind of what I'm trying to show today, is taking seismic data, taking individual pieces of different attributes and organizing it into clusters of information of like properties. And as an example of this, I want to go to some research that was done by Dr. Teuvo Kohonen back in the late 80s, early 90s. And he went to the UN and asked them for statistical information on 126 different countries around the world. And they gave him 39 different pieces of information, kind of like average age, average education, average income, all the statistical data, 39 different pieces in total, that he wanted to organize and see if it could break out and identify the countries. And so in doing so, he wrote a very complex mathematical algorithm that he put in kind of a spreadsheet, similar to what we would do in Excel today, except that he didn't have Excel at the time. And in doing so, he came out with a map, basically. He has a grid based on color, and the colors are they're arbitrary. I mean, I could take any one color and change it to another color, but what this represents is it represents clusters of information, similar information derived from the statistics that he did. So Canada and the US are very similar in color. because they basically have the same properties. So in the seismic world, we're doing that. We're separating out information and putting it into clusters that represent different rock properties. And we can turn on and turn off any one of these clusters, and we can see what part of the map that affects. So I could turn off Canada and US, and that would go black. And here's Nigeria right here. So it's based on looking at multiple seismic pieces of information and turning that into rock properties in the subsurface. Now, the difference between the machine learning I'm using and what else is out there on the market is that instead of looking at the wavelet, say like Stratomagic is based on a starting waveform and an ending waveform, and it maps the changes in the waveform from one point to the other. What I'm doing is I'm looking at sample rate in the seismic data. And so if, for example, if you have an envelope which goes from trough to peak or peak to trough, and that envelope is 30 milliseconds in the subsurface, and you have 2 millisecond data, then I'm parsing and statistically understanding that information 15 times as densely as you would if you were just mapping a peak or a trough. This gives me a very high resolution in the subsurface and lets me see detailed stratigraphy and structural aspects. So here's an example of like 8 different attributes that you might consider. And I'm looking at the information gathered at each sample along inlines and crosslines. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of data points, depending upon the analysis of information that's going to go into a data cloud, and it's going to be assembled by like information. And then it comes out of the data cloud, and because each one of these samples has an X, Y, and Z factor to it, it settles back down and becomes representative of stratigraphy. Now, in the conventional wavelet world, we're always thinking about tuning thickness. And the tuning thickness, of course, is dependent upon depth and frequency of the data. But in the sample world, we're not as affected by frequency changes. And we're certainly not affected by depth because this is all statistical. What we are affected by and what constrains our resolution and understanding of the subsurface is the interval velocity of the rock at any particular sample. So if we're looking at, say, carbonates in the subsurface, and they're a lot faster than sandstones, we might be able to resolve something as little as 3 meters, regardless of depth. And in the clastic world, depending upon the fluid content, of course, I might be able to see something as thin as 2 meters. And I have an example later on in the clastics where I had a discovery of a sand that was only 2 meters thick, but at 11,000 feet deep. So this is the beauty of looking at sample statistics and the classification of data over conventional interpretation. Now, I know that Nigeria probably doesn't have a lot of carbonates that are prime for fossil fuels, but I do want to show a couple of ways that I use this software in the carbonate world. And my first example is one of my favorites, and it'll be a test after all this is over, and I want you all to give me the right answer, right? What's important when you're doing statistical analysis based on sample data is that you have very, very good synthetic ties to your data. Or you may be trying to align information with the wrong cluster. So this is an example of the Edwards line, and the Edwards is this reflector down here. To be able to tie with synthetics all the way up and down and get a pretty good correlation coefficient. Part of the issue is you're generating a lot of attributes. And I generate probably minimum of 17 to 18 attributes with each project that I work on, because you never know which attributes are going to be important to your zone of interest. And how I get away from using all 18 attributes at one time, because I want I want to distill this information down. I want to take all this data and find those attributes, seismic attributes, which are going to be prime to my zone of interest. So we use something we call principal component analysis. And it's just a way of taking out the redundancy of all the attributes. And a good example of redundancy might be if you generated thin bed attribute, and thin bed is created from instantaneous frequency. So right there you have some redundancy in between thin bed and instantaneous frequency. So so this is a way of getting rid of the big data problem and reducing it to a small set of variables. And what we're looking at is the first principal component, say, would be the largest variation of the data. And the eigenvector is the direction of the line showing the variance or spread. Now, humans can see three-dimensionally just fine. Most humans can. But when you are talking about 16, 17, 18 different attributes, then being able to imagine what it's like in the 18th dimension becomes very hard. That's why we use this mathematical process to help us distill the data. And in this first example, I did a principal component evaluation, and it goes through and looks at every inline in the 3D and gives you the evaluation along those lines. So a lot of times I'll pick a line that goes through my best well and look at the stack of attributes that it comes up with. Then I may pick a line that goes through a dry hole and notice the changes in the effect of those attributes on that part of the section. So in this first case, for this first example, the first eigenvector came up with 4 attributes that came to the top immediately: sweetness, envelope, energy absorption, and average energy, all of which can be considered hydrocarbon indicators. And those 4 attributes right there, if you look at their percentage, account for 83% of all the useful information of the 18 attributes that I threw into the pot. Then I went to look at the second eigenvector. And these 3 attributes right here, instantaneous frequency, thin bed, and acceleration of phase, end up being 67% of the useful information after the 83% of the first eigenvector. So already I have accounted for most of the variance in the data in just 7 attributes. But I went on to look at a third one, and here's where I have Hilbert. Relative acoustic impedance is usually my porosity indicator, and instantaneous phase is usually the lithostratigraphy indicator. So I took a combination of those attributes and I went in to evaluate this area. A client had come to me. They had been trying to sell this opportunity to drill a well for over 2 years and couldn't get anyone convinced that they knew what they were doing. So here's the test. I've got a strike line running down the backbone of a reef system, and the Edwards in this area is 15,000 feet deep, or 4,570 meters. So it's a deep well. And the cost of this well was about $7 million at the time. And I had a well that was drilled in the 60s by a really big multinational oil company. And they tested it, and they perfed it, and they cored it, and they did all the science on it, but all they got was gas, and they were looking for oil. So they plugged the well. Then in the 1970s, I had a large independent come through and drilled this well over here. And they didn't get a whiff of gas. They didn't have any shows at all. And they walked away from it, of course. Then in the 80s, I had another large independent that came over here and drilled this well. And they perfed it. They did not acidize or treat it in any way. And it started flowing about 3 million cubic feet of gas a day. But like everybody else, they didn't really want the gas. Gas prices were not favorable at that time. And so they completed in a zone of hole, but they did report all the testing they did. So my question to the audience is, can you tell me the difference between the dry hole and the 2 wells with shows? Just looking at the seismic information. A lot of geophysicists, a lot of interpreters would say, well, you have more amplitude over here. That might be indicating something that's more tight. But generally speaking, most people would map this and really not be able to tell you where the reservoir is. But when you do the neural analysis and the classification of the data, and here's my recipe. I use attenuation, envelope. I ran the fault skeleton, and we'll get into that in just a short. Hilbert, instantaneous frequency, instantaneous phase. I had energy absorption, relative acoustic impedance, sweetness, and fin bed. So these happen to be the top 3 or 4 attributes from my prior principal component analysis. And what you'll notice is that you see this blue and this green right here. And you see it at the well that was drilled in the 60s, and you see it at the well that was drilled in the 80s, but you don't see it at the dry hole. Now, the interpretation of this would be, okay, you've got a fractured carbonate at 15,000 feet, highly pressured gas reservoir. What's going to happen? It's going to have a tendency to leak. That reservoir is going to have a tendency to leak into the seal, the shales above the reservoir, and change the rock properties ever so subtly of that shale. So everywhere you see this blue, in this case, that would be where you have good reservoir. And in case, and so you have blue here, you have blue here, you have no blue over here. So then I can say, well, show me where that is. And I can look at a map where I've turned all the other clusters off, except for the fault and fracture clusters, and the key neuron or the key cluster that says blue, which is where my reservoir is. Now, my client, who was a drilling engineer, wanted to drill a well that started about here, and he wanted to do a 6,000-foot lateral and end up just about over here. Oh, and by the way, when I did this analysis, we took it to the market. They had been trying to sell this idea for 2 years. We sold it in 4 showings. So we found 4 companies willing to take the risk to do this once they understood that we could actually see where the reservoir was. And so I told my client, I said, you're going to be crossing a big fracture system right here. And I would change the direction of the lateral so that you don't intercept a big fracture. And he said, well, I think I can handle it. We'll do some things mechanically to get us through the fracture system. And to me, I mean, the risk in knowing where the reservoir is was taken away with the neural analysis, but there's still, in my mind, a huge mechanical risk. And in fact, we started drilling the well, we turned lateral, started having a 60-foot flare. And the minute we hit this fracture system, we lost circulation. We stuck the bottom hole assembly. And they tried for 2 weeks to get it out and ended up twisting off. So basically, almost $7 million of investment was lost in something that most people would understand all along. They're still messing with a shallower opportunity that they're completing now, but you can see that it was a mistake to try to cross this fracture. For those of you in the drilling aspects, this would be a no-brainer, right? But here's the interesting thing. Because of the detail that you can see with sample statistics, the dry hole that was drilled back in the 70s, if they had moved back 300 or 400 meters, they would have had a discovery. Because here's the back reef porosity indicator, and here's the fore reef porosity indicator. And likewise, the 1960s well that had all the good shows and took the cores and everything, if they had moved 400 or 500 meters south, they would have had a complete dry hole with no shows. They got into the highest structurally back reef porosity, and then here's the fore reef porosity. So here's where the understanding of machine learning and statistical information gained from sample rather than wavelets can help you avoid mistakes and help you understand the stratigraphy a lot better. So my next carbonate example is really shallow. I have a client that came to me. They were focused on 3 wells drilled back in the 1960s that had made 158,000 barrels of oil, but at only 2,100 feet. So that's what, 800 meters. I mean, very shallow. And because it was also a carbonate that was fractured and very faulted, as you can see from the faulting in here, they thought that the trap type was actually along the fractures and the faults. So they shot this very high resolution 3D, and they recorded it at 1 millisecond. And because it's a carbonate, I resampled to half. I've learned over the years that you can take the original data and resample it to half of what it was and not induce any noise. So I went to half a millisecond sampling on this to get better statistics. And then after they shot the 3D, they proceeded to drill 3 dry holes, 2 pilots that were dry, and then they tried a lateral and then 2 was dry. So after spending about $20 million in this area, they came to me and said, what could I figure out? Well, I looked at the gathers and noticed that, of course, a carbonate is going to be a peak event. So I'm looking and seeing some slight ABO effect at the gather that was placed at the best well, made 128,000 barrels. Now, it was long depleted, but there's always residual. So you can see kind of some of the rock properties that are involved when you see a positive ABO in a carbonate. And when I did my analysis, I noticed something very unique. You can see here's the zone of perforation right here. This is just an enlargement of this area right here. The zone of perforation ties perfectly to this yellow color, this yellow cluster. But above, you see this kind of gray area, and below you see all this red. And then it goes away. So there's a phenomenon when you start looking at the rock property information from the neural analysis that I call a halo. This would be a frequency change above the reservoir. And then the neurons below, which are drastically different colors than the reservoir or the rock around it, I call the neural equivalent of a dim out. Now, in the wavelet world, dim outs are very hard to see, but they're basically frequency changes in the data as it's acquired when it goes through a reservoir. So they're very important, and the halo neurons are very important. This would be the equivalent of the seal, the leak into the seal that we just saw previously. So these are the things you want to look out for, not just what cluster you're tying to with your perforations. And you can see that this is very thin pay. I mean, we're talking 3 samples for about 21 feet and 4 samples in this well, which is only about 24 feet. So we're talking about very thin pay, even though it's very shallow. Now, my client thought that the pay type or the play type was going to be along the fractures and the faults. But if you start looking, and here this number 71 cluster is equivalent to the yellow in the previous slide. And all these green, I just didn't change the colors in the software. The green is equivocal to the red right here. So this would be the new red, and this is the green. But what you start to see, what your eye starts to see, is that these are actually more channel-like than they are following any particular fracture or fault trend. And something I want you to notice here, now a lot of dry holes were drilled around the original wells after they had long depleted. People kept trying to search in this one area for more production. But what you'll notice is that with all of the samples turned on, you can see the clusters. You can see how the clusters are related to each other in the map. There's another aspect of this, and it's called low probability. Now, here's a cluster in the data, and here are all the data points that belong to that cluster. There are some data points that are on the very, very outside edges of that cluster, but still part of that cluster. And these are what we call anomalous data points or low probability data points. And even though it goes against your train of thought about low probability, it actually comes from the lowest probability of being at the centroid or the center of the cluster. Now, in the years that I've been using this, when I've used AVO volumes or far angle stacks, hydrocarbon indicator volumes, these low probability data points end up being where my AVO anomalies are. I've had several discoveries just looking at low probability areas. So I wanted you to think about that, about what's anomalous and what's anomalous in the data, and then look at this picture again. So when I have low probability turned on, and I'm looking at the outer 10% of the data points, you'll notice that all the reds and greens around the old production is gone. Now let me go back and show you this again. So here's the low probability. Here's where it's all turned on, and here's where it's gone. When you have a 3D that's shot well after production has depleted, that area is no longer anomalous. So this is a good way to use machine learning to help you understand depletion in old fields. I've used this several times to look at depletion and look at stranded opportunities. So this is a good way to take another part of the probability volume and not only look at what's still anomalous, which all this is probably still live oil right here, but look at depletion as well. And to prove my point to my client, this is a coherence time slice, and you can see evidence of channels eroded into the surface of the Austin Chalk, which is an unconformity in itself. The top of the Austin Chalk is unconformable. So when it was subaerially exposed, there was a lot of opportunity to erode channels into the chalk. You can see evidence of it right here. And in fact, the actual pay, which here is less than 10 feet thick, is a carbonate sand, more or less. It just eroded into the top of the chalk. So it didn't turn out that it was along fractures and faults. It turns out that it was channels eroded into the top of the chalk, and that's where the hydrocarbons were accumulating. And my last example, carbonate, I promise I'll go into clastics after this, is a case of another client whose perception of the subsurface was different from what actually happened. And this is the beauty of the unclassified, unsupervised classification of data over the supervised classification of data. What I want to do is I want to turn all this loose on the computer and have it tell me what I want to interpret. I don't want to put endpoints on it and say, here are my beliefs, stay within those beliefs. Because you're going to be surprised that Mother Nature doesn't always lay down like your perception. And this is a prime case right here. There are two very famous fields in Alabama in the US that are producing from what we call the Smackover Formation, which is Jurassic in age. The previous example was Cretaceous in age, but this is Jurassic. And my client had a 3D over here, and his conception was that these oolitic debris off of Smackover reefs were actually channelized. So this is the area he wanted me to look at to prove his channel theory. And so what we're looking at here is there's a series of 1,000,000-barrel wells, and then we go into some wells that are not 1,000,000 barrels, they're around 500,000. And then he had all these proposed locations down here where he wanted to drill and find the channel that he thought was there, okay? So, and this is the quality of the amplitude data, which is pretty good quality in here. And the reservoir is somewhere down in here. So here again is the amplitude data. Here's all the wells that were with cumulative production over 1,000,000 barrels apiece. Then you get into the wells that are less than 500,000 barrels. And then here's a few of his proposed locations. Now, when I did my analysis, what popped out to me, of course, color is, geologists love color. I mean, I get kind of bored with interpreting conventional data because you can't get very colorful with it. But right off the bat, I can see the reservoir for the 1,000,000-barrel wells looks completely different from the reservoir in those wells which produced less than 500,000 barrels. And right here. And then here are a couple of his locations that he wanted to drill. Okay. And the reefs are very outstanding. I mean, they cut off the reservoir. All this is residual oolitic shoal information from the erosion off the reefs in the Smackover. And I really wanted to focus on the best reservoir. So I looked at the wells that made 1 million barrels plus and noticed the numbers of the clusters that I could see. I also took into account the clusters that made up the reef. And here's my recipe: attenuation, envelope, Hilbert, frequency, phase, relative acoustic impedance, sweetness, and thin bed again. So if I turn on the neurons that made up the reef and the neurons that made up the 1 million barrel wells, what you see is this kind of distribution. And this kind of makes sense. I mean, the reefs are not perfect. I mean, the Edwards Reef is pretty interesting, but this is a much different reef complex. And here's all the proposed locations he had for looking for his channel. And I said, why don't you drill up in here? Why don't you drill here? Why don't you drill here? And his comment was, and of course in the US, the population owns the mineral rights. So he said he didn't have the leases of these owners, these surface owners right here. And he was bound and determined to prove the channel theory correct. So he drilled this well first. In spite of everything I showed him, he drilled this well first, and it was a dry hole with a show. And then he was so convinced that his channel theory was correct, he came up here and drilled this well right next to the reef and had a second dry hole with no shows. So here's a case where he was convinced that his thought about the subsurface was totally correct, and he ignored anything that the statistical information gave him to go back in here and try to drill some 1 million barrel wells. I see a hand raised. Do you want me to? I think the idea is to take questions at the end of the presentation. So if you want to type your question into the chat, that will help me, if you don't mind. So a couple of other things that you can do with carbonates, but you can do these with clastics too. A lot of people will shoot their data course in time and then convert to depth. Well, in order to have a really accurate depth model, to be very good in the depth conversion, you need to have your formation tops spot on. And in West Texas, in the Permian Basin, it's very difficult because there's a lot of formations that have very thinly laminated carbonates and shales. So people tend to pick tops all over the place, thinking that their correlations are great. But obviously, Mother Nature is showing you the stratigraphic depositional information. And I use this a lot of times to adjust the formation tops back up to where they should be before going into depth conversion. So that's just a little perk that comes along with it. And then in certain areas, this is an example from the North Sea. In certain areas, I've got carbonate on carbonate. And of course, you don't have much variation in your velocity. So you really can't see that depositional break from one carbonate to the next. And I mean, there could be a huge unconformity there, and you may be looking at something in the Jurassic sitting on top of something in the Cambrian, but it's hard to see because the acoustic impedance changes are not great. But again, you can use this statistical methodology to look at discrete depositional environments and be able to map the carbonate on carbonate interface much more easily than you can in the wavelet world. As I did with this, so I've got a dolomite sitting on another dolomite and then I've got the pin and conformity. So there's basically no interface change between this. It's all over the map. It's really hard to map, but you can map it easily because you can see the depositional changes in between the two carbonates. So that's just an extra little bonus when it comes to mapping. And that could be used in thick sandstones, that can be used in anything where you're trying to do a depth conversion or get your mapping, your stratigraphic mapping correct. So let's go into the carbonate. Let's go into the clastics. And I have a salt dome that I'm working in Texas that has some unique things going on. The shallow part of the dome was drilled, the discovery well was 1929, and they're still drilling some wells, but now we're starting to look at opportunities off the sides of the dome and what's deeper. And there was a series of wells drilled in the 1980s, which hit a formation called the Yewa, which is Eocene age. And there's some marginal wells, and here is an old well, 1953, the 5.5, 2.0 BCF, 4.1. But there's two outstanding wells, 9.3 BCF and 7.4 BCF, which were drilled right along with all these. And in talking to the geologist who had this project before I got it, he said, oh, it's just all one big channel. It's just, it's thinner in some areas, but it's all one big channel through here. I think, well, and looking at the disparity between the production, I kind of questioned that. And so I have two arbitrary lines. I have this arbitrary that comes down through here, through these two wells, and on over here. And then I have an arbitrary that comes here, here, through here, and then up here. Okay, this is one of the two best wells. So in this arbitrary, the north to south arbitrary, I'm seeing where they perforated, but I'm not seeing great examples of any kind of continuous channel. And the sands they perforated are very thin and not consistent at all, anywhere from 10 feet, maybe to 25 feet, and scattered over here, thinly laminated. But when I run my neural analysis on it, it makes a little bit more sense. This greens and blues kind of represent a shale base to the production, to the sands that are here in the wells. And I've kind of blown them up so you can see them. I've got a shale base right here that's blue, and this well was about 25 feet. This well was about 15 feet, but kind of hit all these little laminates right here. And then this well right here was again about 15 to 20 feet thick. And so it kind of made more sense because I could see kind of a shale base and see how these things were lining up. Then I went to the other line and through one of the best wells. And that made a little bit more sense when you're interpreting a channel, because it's a little bit more consistent. You can follow the reflector through a little bit better. And the neural analysis again showed this nice shale base. But over here where I have one of my best wells, the sand is like 120 feet thick. Very thin over here, very thick right here. And I'm interpreting this as a halo neuron because I've got leak out of this pressured sand going into the shales above it. And then all of a sudden I'm out of it again with this well. When you look at it in a map view, and I've recolored some of the neurons to make sense stratigraphically, that here's actually my channel. The two best wells actually hit the really thick sands in the channel, and all the rest of the wells were in overbank deposits, side lobes. They weren't as thick. There was some communication between side lobes and channel in some of the wells. But so you have 4 or 5 BCF instead of 8 or 9 BCF. And there's still some areas that, when gas prices get a little bit better around the world, that someone might want to come in and drill. But basically this allows you to see what's channel and what's not, and what's overbank, and understand the depositional environment and the stratigraphy better. And related to this, I will look deeper, and I'm looking at not only the Yewa, but I'm looking at a formation that's a little bit deeper called the Cook Mountain. And I'm actually getting ready to drill this well right here. Here's my salt on this salt dome. But I'm seeing, wow, there's some really deep stuff. And we're talking somewhere down around 14,000 feet, 11,000 feet that look opportune. And they look just like the 17 BCF of production right here. The neurons that produced in these two wells are exactly the same stack as the neurons that are here, 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 and here. Now I want to look at what the low probability says. And the low probability, as you've seen before, is showing me what's anomalous. That's anomalous. The well I'm getting ready to drill is anomalous. The 2 wells over here are anomalous. So looking at that and the comparison between the clusters at known production and clusters that are the same as the known production, plus the probability, greatly reduces the risk in drilling an 11,000-foot well. And if I look at the coherence, you can see this highly coherent sand coming up to the edge of the salt, as well as the highly coherent sands here and the well I'm getting ready to drill. Taking it a step further, I want to isolate those key neurons that I'm seeing in the known channel production and my prospect, and look at the areas face down on this dome to see how big they are. These 2 wells produce 400,000 barrels and 17 BCF of gas. This well is probably good for 2.5 BCF of gas and 200,000 barrels a well, 200,000 barrels. These are much larger. This one happens to be the shallowest one and the cheapest one to drill. So we want to do a proof of concept to drill this well first. But if this well works, then I have all these different opportunities to drill around the dome. Not only that, and here's kind of a side view where you can see them going up the edges of the dome, but I've got another whole section down in here that could be a possibility. And this well was a dry hole, but it hit this gap between all this stuff. Now, if I go to low probability and look at the most anomalous data points in all this area, what you see is a lot of it goes away. Now, my little prospect I'm getting ready to drill is right here, but look at this channel, the sinuous channel right here. If you do the calculations on all these areas, there's somewhere around 300 to 400 BCF of gas and I think 5 to 6 million barrels of oil just in going after this stuff. So this is a way to reduce risk, to highlight and easily see exploration opportunities or development opportunities in clastics. Now, here's an example of where I'm using artificial intelligence and machine learning. And this is an example from the Delaware Basin, which is just the northern portion of the Permian Basin in Texas. This goes into New Mexico. And I had a problem. I have marl sand, Mississippian age production right here in a sand that's fairly thin. And then this is a coherent slice right at that sand. But it's hard to see what's faulting, what's stratigraphy in this coherence. So I use artificial intelligence to create a fault model, and then I'll run a fault attribute. Here's an arbitrary line coming down through all the marl wells, all the sand wells, on down through some dry holes and some production. And you can see hints of faulting in here, but you move 2 or 3 lines away and it's completely different. This is very difficult stratigraphically to try to interpret. My top of marl is this event right here. So I know I'm tied in well synthetically. So what I did is and then this is just an inline coming across so you can see what's going on, where are the faults. There's a fault here, you move 2 or 3 lines away, it's gone. So it's hard to track and trace these faults. So I use artificial intelligence to go through a couple of fault models that we have and generate a fault attribute volume. So here's a time slice at basically almost 1.5 seconds, going through the production in the marl. And then I co-blended it with the coherence information. So now I can go back to my coherence and say, okay, there's a fault there. This is a liniment coming through here, a strike slip fault coming through here. Then I can start to look at and separate and understand the production in the marl a little bit better than I could. So I can combine that fault attribute volume that I create with the stratigraphic information, and I can see the faults and the stratigraphy and the deposition at the same time. And gosh, my best well in here that everyone tried to copy by drilling around it, which made about 5 BCF, is in a very small fault wedge. It's basically compartmentalized. and separated from all the other wells in the Morrow field. And here it is. It's in this little tiny fault sliver. I've blown it up right here. This well didn't produced about 1 BCF. This is 5 BCF. This well was outside the block. This well was outside the block. And this was a dry hole. So my fault wedge for that best well is right here. And here's my recipe of attributes that I used. Now, with the fault attribute, I can create what they call geobodies. I know the inline spacing. I know the sample rate. I can turn these into basically small volumes. And if you had Petrel, you could absolutely export this out of the software package and take it into Petrel and turn these into fault surfaces, which is very slick, keeps you from manually having to pick all these faults. And then I can combine that fault surface, and here's a kind of a close-up so you can see the surfaces, and you can see how they kind of swirl around and the angles and the offsets. And I can combine that with my stratigraphic information to more clearly understand the compartmentalization in here. And when I look at it even more closely, I can see that here's my 5 BCF well. Here's my fault compartment right here. This well made about a BCF. It barely caught, it did not catch the best part of the sand, which is this brown right here. I have no wells that have penetrated this or even up in here. So I can use this as an understanding of not only the compartmentalization in here, but where the best rock properties are for the sands that are going to give you the best production. So again, reducing risk in drilling and or development work when you can understand the fault situation and the stratigraphy completely. An example of thin bed, this is a discovery I had a few years ago. I had a client that came to me and he said, well, I've got a well here that produced about 450,000 barrels of oil from a thin Alabel sand that's about 1.8 meters thick, okay? I have a few wells down here that had poor production. We think they were mechanical failures, but they produced from the same sand, but they only produced 20 or 30,000 barrels. And I had this expanse all up and down here, but where I have no well penetrations. This dry hole was drilled by Phillips in 1956 and had beautiful sidewall cores, but they never completed the well because the sand was too thin. So, I mean, you know, a lot of things happened in the 50s and 60s and even 70s that we can key off of to find new production today. So when I looked at the data and I created my synthetic to tie, the perforations, now this well was originally drilled for a deeper objective, and the deeper objective was dry, but they had passed through this little sand on the way down and they came up to completing it. And so we're talking about 3,200 or almost 3,300 meters deep for something that's 7 feet thick. And at that point, at the time of this analysis, had already produced 450,000 barrels of oil. But you can barely map it. In fact, what I had to do is I actually mapped the trough above it and then flattened on that trough and pulled up a flattened time slice to kind of see the extent of this little wisp. And you can see it right here. You can see, you can kind of have a peak, peak's gone, peak's gone. So it comes and goes really quickly. And here's kind of a strike line going through the wells that did not produce a lot along the edges of that feature and to the well that was perforated. What it turns out is that it's a little offshore bar that's buried at 11,000 feet. And the well caught the forward edge or the wave base edge, which is where the best porosity is developed, on this little bar. Here it is, a long strike, and you'll notice that it gets kind of patchy over here where you get to the wells that were productive, but thought to be mechanical failures. And an aerial view of it looks like this. Now, again, this is a flat time slice, so I'm missing a few pieces. But it turns out that the wells that were poor producers were not because they were mechanical failures, but they were on small pieces of sand that were very limited reservoirs. Here's the well that made 450,000 barrels, and I'm interpreting this as a tidal cut through the bar, and actually separating the production from in this well to the well my client drilled. Now, if you look at it in the US, we have production units, and this is an 80-acre laydown production unit, and here's the well that has produced 450,000 barrels of oil. So what we did is we came illegal 467 outside of the production unit and drilled our well. And not only did we find 1.8 meters of pay, about 6 feet, that came on at 250 barrels of oil a day and 1.1 million cubic feet of gas, but we had a thin pay, 4 feet thick, just a hair over a meter, in a small bar up zone. And this particular zone in the fault block has produced 200,000 or 300,000 barrels of oil since we drilled this well. Now I turned on all the neurons and colored them red to show you the total extent of the sand that made up that bar. And it's very geologic in nature. And there's some areas in here where we could go drill wells. The update on this, and this is the recipe. The update on this is that now we have 5, and actually there's a 6th well that since I made this in here, and it's produced 1.2 million barrels of oil and a little over 10 BCF of gas. The ultimate EUR for this is close to 20 BCF of gas and 2 million barrels of oil from something that's barely 2 meters thick that you could not see and map in the conventional data. So this is where the resolution of using sample statistics is very important. If there were 100 of these in this county, in Brazoria County, and which is virtually covered with 3Ds, if you could find 100 of these, that would be, 200 million barrels of oil and 2 TCF of gas. But conventionally, you can't see it, and so you don't know it's there. So in conclusion, I'm leaving a lot of time for questions because I'm hoping there'll be a lot. You don't have to always look to see evidence of direct hydrocarbon indicators when looking for reservoirs, because you can see and understand from halo neurons and dim out neurons where the reservoir is. Deep pressure reservoirs, again, can be looked for halo clusters, but in the case of the Austin Chalk, which was very shallow, it still had some leak out of that reservoir. All reservoirs leak, and it just depends on the seal above them as whether they're viable for exploration or not. The self-organized map is really good for understanding difficult stratigraphy, especially when you have like carbonate on carbonate interfaces. It can help you with depth migration by properly placing formation sequence boundary ties in wells. Using principal component analysis can help you eliminate a lot of information and get down to the core attributes you want to use in your recipe for SOM. And in my mind, a lot of people ask me about inversion. And I'll just say that inversion is dependent on well information and petrophysical information. It's a model, just like classification is. But the problem with inversion, not only is it time consuming to do and costly, but the minute you get 4 or 5 kilometers away from your well control, the model starts falling apart and increases risk in drilling wells. Classifying the data is a way of looking at rock properties without petrophysical information. You're using an eyeball comparison. We do have ways to prove that the petrophysical information in a reservoir ties to specific neurons. But to me, the classification gives you much lowers risk and gives you much better information further away from your well control than inversion ever could. Plus, it's cheap to do this. And using the probability volume can help you determine what's truly anomalous or the best rock properties of any one cluster. And it can, when you have shot the 3D well beyond the depletion of the field that you're interested in, can show you depletion. and this is especially applicable when you're doing 4D, like big companies with offshore fields are doing 4D seismic all the time, maybe once a year, maybe every 6 months, and reprocessing the data. This is an excellent methodology to be able to show the depletion from one 3D capture to another. And this analysis, this process works in time or depth. I can create all my attributes in depth just as easily as I can create them in time. And it works on 2D data or 3D data. So with that, I think I will stop and take on any questions if you've written them in the chat or have verbal questions. Is that okay?
Thank you. Yes, no, that's going to work. But first of all, many big thanks to yourself, Ms. Deborah Sacrey, for this excellent presentation, right? It's been a lot of a wow moment for me here. And I can imagine that is the same thing for many people on the call. I mean, I was checking. We've had about 145, 150 people who have stayed from your beginning till now. That shows the interest actually you're raising in here. So I really want to say a very big thank you for this excellent presentation. And again, it was quite good to see. I mean, when you started with those 3 wells, you know, showing the ones that the 2 of them that found gas and then the one that is that was dry. You know, what could have happened? I mean, if they had the kind of data set that you have and analysis, you know, they could have actually done the right thing. And, you know, quite good to see the application around, you know, the thin bed, even the high pressured, high temperature well, and again, meandering channels, you know, so quite elaborate. So I really want to say a big thank you for this comprehensive session already. I mean, you can already see the applause, but because of time, I will hand over to the public secretary. There's lots of questions, by the way. So I don't know how many we're going to be taking, but I'll hand over to the public secretary to help us to moderate that session. Again, before we come to a vote of thanks. But just to mention up front, before we get to that Q&A, I know I missed out mentioning this, but I'm also interested to know, Deborah Sacrey, that right there in Houston, we have a very active NAPE chapter. You know, so we have a North America chapter that is actually based in Houston, and I'm sure there will be a lot of even collaboration. I'm sure they will be interested to also have you, you know, have some follow-up with this kind of topic with them for our chapter led by Deborah, who is actually part of your House of Delegates for AAPG. So on that note, let me hand over to the Public Secretary right now to take us through the Q&A. Sorry, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question from a gentleman that says, what features of the seismic data works well with your ML approach? What machine learning methods did you use, and how much training data did you need? The methodology here is once you have created all your attributes, then you assemble the attributes that you want to use in your analysis. I will create a harvest window around either a really good well or a field, and then I will let the training from that harvest data, and usually I have a timeout on the epochs of the amount of times it goes around and looks at the data at 100, and then let it train the rest of the 3D or a particular area of the 3D that my client's interested in. So the learning method is a harvest window that you create around wells. And sometimes I harvest around good wells and then look at that result and harvest around dry holes just to see what turns up as anomalous or not. If you harvest around dry holes, then good wells become very anomalous. If you harvest around really good wells, then nothing within that harvest area seems anomalous to the data. So there's 2 different methodologies of approach, but I usually create a harvest window within the 3D around particular zones that I'm interested in. Hopefully that answered your question. Then I have another question that says, given the complexity of geological attributes, how do you determine the cutoff criteria for selecting the eigenvectors used in your analysis? And that's an excellent question. What I tend to do is I tend to look at those whose percentages are in 2 digits, and I cut off after 2 digits. If the top 4 eigenvector, top 4 attributes in like the first eigenvector are 23, 17, 16, 15, and then I go to 8, I'll cut it off at 2 digits. and not include any of the ones that are 1 digit.
Okay. No, so thanks. So Deborah, I know you've answered 2 of the questions on the Q&A, but there are a few questions on the chat. So, Mime, if you can hear me, can you take it over from here and pull out the questions that are mixed up in the chat? There are a lot more questions on the chat. Can you hear me, Mime?
Oh, I can hear you. Let me just go through this chat now. Okay. Okay, hold on.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat.
Okay, I see 2 questions. Have
No,
you
not the one on the Q&A. The one on the Q&A, she has already answered. So it's the one on the chat, the webinar chat.
On the chat. Okay, let me. Okay. Let me just scroll up. Since SOM is not tied to the well's petrophysical, how do one handle uncertainties across the wells?
Okay, I'm trying to find that in the chat because it's a lot easier for me to read it than it is to understand the accent. I apologize.
But did you? Okay. So when since SOM is not tied to the well's petrophysical, how do one handle uncertainties across the wells?
Again, self-organized maps is just the organization or the classification of information. And so the way to apply it is to make sure you have good synthetics tying the data to the wells. And then I look at where the DST was, where the cores were, where the perforations were, where they tested water. And I use that to visually correlate the results of the clusters to the well itself. And the problem with synthetics, in the wavelet world, you can get kind of loosey-goosey. But when you're down to the samples, you want to make sure that you're as spot on as possible so that you're not correlating a perforation interval with the wrong cluster. Now, obviously, geologists have an innate sense of pattern recognition. So you can see quickly if you're a little bit 1 or 2 milliseconds off when you're tying to a channel sequence or you're tying to a turbidite or a reef. So you take that with a grain of salt, but this will give you information. It will not interpret it for you. It takes a good interpreter of the data and understanding of the subsurface to make the correct interpretation. And hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. We will not be able to take all these questions, I'm afraid. So there's another one. When do you do PCA? When do you do PCA, your resulting attributes are different sets of attributes? How do you tie them back to seismic attributes that you calculated?
Right. So something I didn't show an example of, but I have many examples. Is once you're looking at a particular cluster, you have the opportunity or you have the means of opening up that cluster and looking at the contribution from each attribute that makes up that cluster. So, and then you can create cross sections and extract the cluster information and put it next to petrophysical information so that you can start making sense that this cluster represents 10% porosity in this sand. This cluster may represent 20% porosity. I've been able to go in on a fine detailed basis and be able to differentiate porosity changes within fields. Not 2 or 3%. It takes a pretty good jump to change the rock property significantly to create a new cluster, but you can start to break that out. And I will build cross sections and I'll extract the neural information and put it next to the petrophysical information, and then start really digging in to see what that cluster of information represents. I can also look, again, looking at the makeup, if hydrocarbon indicators and porosity indicators are the top contributors to that cluster, then I know that cluster has significance when it comes to porosity and hydrocarbons. If I get something like instantaneous phase or Hilbert, or attributes which are not direct hydrocarbon indicators, then I know I'm looking at a cluster that represents some kind of lithology or stratigraphy. So intuitively, what you need to do is have a good understanding of these attributes before you use them in the SOM. That way, when you look at the attribute contribution, you have an innate sense of what that cluster is really representing. Hopefully that answered the question.
Okay. So this is going to be the last question. How does an interpreter understand what each neuron picked signifies when focusing on hydrocarbon indicators when using a ML software like Paradise?
Again, that's kind of similar to the question I just answered. There are means within this software to petrophysically tie the cluster information to well logs, and you can actually even cross plot. You can create a cross plot of the neural information with petrophysical cutoffs, like for porosity or water saturation or something like that, and be able to highlight, much like you do in the AVO world, highlight those areas statistically which represent reservoir and which don't represent reservoir. So when I was first working on this software, that was one of the biggest challenges we had from people who said, oh, this is nothing but black box, and that it doesn't relate to anything petrophysically. So over the last 2 or 3 years, we have gone through and put together methodologies to actually prove that these clusters, these neurons do represent hydrocarbons, do represent rock properties that we're looking for in the subsurface. So I just didn't show that today. I was trying to get through and show you how it can be used for interpretation. But maybe in the future, I can give another presentation that shows the application of the petrophysical alignment with the neural information.
Okay, thanks so much. I think this is all of the questions we can take at this time. Thank you so much for the very insightful presentation, Stacey. At this point, I'll call.
So I do have one.
Okay.
I do have one question. I have a gentleman who is asking if they can get the slides, and you've recorded it, and it's going to be on the YouTube channel, or you've had it, so they certainly can have access to the information. All these slides, I have permission from my clients to release. And some of them have been sanitized without telling specific areas, but certainly they're all available publicly, and so you may share this with anyone. And if anyone has additional questions, please email me, and my email address is dsacrey, SACREY, at Auburn, AUBURN, energy, ENERGY.com. And I will do my best to answer your questions.
And we can actually drop it on the chat box so that they can also, I can actually do it from here. So that's fine. I'll drop it on the chat box so that people can actually pick it up. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, back to you, PS.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Stacey. Thank you, President. So at this point, we would be calling the President-elect, Mrs. Ola Jumoke, to give the closing remarks, or the vote of thanks, sorry.
Well, thank you, everyone, for allowing me to take up a little bit of your time this afternoon.
Thank you. No, PE, you're muted. PE, you're muted.
I didn't catch that.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Thank you very much, Deborah. I was, following all your presentation from the very beginning, and I really enjoyed every bit of it. Thank you for sharing knowledge with us. And, the use of technology cannot be undermined at all. Your presentation further underscores the importance of applying the right technology to help us find oil. There are lots of failed wells that were drilled just because something small that should have been done wasn't done. So thank you very much for the thought-provoking presentation. I've taken notes, and I'm sure others on this call also did. And I really appreciate you for also willing to spare your time to answer questions even after this presentation. For you to have dropped your email address shows that you are ready to continue to give that knowledge. We really appreciate, and we look forward for more collaborations between NAPE and AAPG. And you having spent 49 years in the oil and gas industry, you don't look it at all. I think one of these days I will ask you the secret, what you've done. Is it the geology and geophysics and then looking at seismic every time that has helped? Thank you very much. And I can see you really love this profession. I'm also a geophysicist. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
I just turned 72. I just turned 72 2 weeks ago.
You said?
Yeah.
72.
Oh, 72. Wow. I must get in touch to know what you did to remain this young. You look 30 years younger than your age. That's very good.
That's good.
Thank you. And thank you very much. And to our fellows on the call, first, I want to thank our president, Mr. John Bosco Uche, for your time, and also staying with us from the beginning to this time. This is actually a good initiative. And I believe that we will continue to have meetings like this, sharing knowledge across, the waters, coming, giving us your own experience from America there. We also sharing ours here will really help us to grow the industry, not only locally, but globally. We have Madam Iyabo Sindiku, FNAPE, on the call. We also have with us Mr. Charles Ojo, FNAPE. We have Oga K. Kanu, FNAPE. Thank you very much all for joining. We have Professor Betsy Ozumba, FNAPE. We have Mr. Abiodun Bayewu, FNAPE. We have Mr. Chikwe Edozien, FNAPE, on the call too. Thank you very much for joining. Mr. Femi Eson, FNAPE. Oga Victor Agbe Davis, FNAPE, thank you very much for your support and even your contribution to making this happen. We appreciate you. And we have Mr. Demola Lanisa, North American Chapter Coordinator. Thank you for joining. We have Dr. Victor Ogumola, North American Chapter member. Thank you very much. We have Raymond Cahill of EAGE. Thank you for joining. And we appreciate all other NAPE members and friends that have joined this meeting today. I believe that we've all taken one or two things away from Deborah's presentation. And to all our ESCOs who also joined on the call, we have our PS who has been anchoring this program from the beginning. Thank you very much. We have our UAPC, we have our AGS, AEIC, and everybody on the call. We appreciate your time. And we believe that from time to time, we'll be having things like this. And Deborah, I know that when we call on you the next time, you will answer our call. And I look forward to seeing you at our NAPE conference this year. Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you.
All right.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
And we'll bye now. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
PE, let's thank you too.
You said?
I said, let's thank you too, PE.
We thank God. All right. Good one. Good one. I really enjoyed it. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye.